Chapter 2, Section 4, The Rise of New Empires. We've already mentioned the Assyrian Empire, but just briefly in Section 3, so now we're going to talk about it a little bit more. As far as geography, where Assyrian Empire was, it was started in Assyria, which is Upper Mesopotamia, or present-day Syria. And you can see that on page 62. There's a map there, and so it's labeled even as Syria today. They used iron weapons, which they didn't invent or create. They were created by the Hittites to establish this Assyrian Empire by 700 BC. Now, Assyria included Mesopotamia, part of Iran or the Iranian Plateau, sections of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. But all good things must come to an end, and within 100 years, a lot of civil wars and internal problems started to cause the breakdown of the empire, and the Assyrian Empire collapsed. Not before they had an influence around the area or the region, especially with the Hebrews conquering them and affecting them. So they ended in 612 BC, and they collapsed because of the Chaldeans taking them over. So you can see when you look at the map that the red region is all the Assyrian Empire. Syria is right dead in the middle, so that was a good strategic location. All right, on your maps, we have labeled the Tigris River, Euphrates River, Mediterranean Sea, Persian Gulf, Mesopotamia, and Babylon from Section 1. Section 2, we labeled Egypt, Nile River, Red Sea, and then we talked about the Mediterranean Sea again. Section 3, we labeled Asia Minor, the capital city of the Hittites, Hattusha, Phoenicia, Canaan, and Jerusalem. Now we're going to label Assyria, and that is that bar that's kind of going across there. It's out of Mesopotamia to the west, but it's in Mesopotamia to the right or the east. All right, the height of the Assyrians, the kings had the absolute power. It was a very well organized empire, and local officials in this huge area reported directly back to the king, and they had a very efficient system of communication, which was based on a system of roads. I would say it's very similar to the U.S.'s Pony Express, and they actually used horses to communicate using those roads. And so if a king had a question about some far-reaching area of the empire, he could have that answered within a week. They also created a library at Nineveh, and Nineveh is up on the Tigris River, and this library housed thousands of cuneiform clay tablets, very important clay tablets like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, or other cuneiforms such as the Code of Hammurabi. All right, they were very good conquerors and effective leaders and fighters. They were had a very large army, and it was very disciplined. They had lots of foot soldiers, horse soldiers, and they had horse-drawn chariots. And again, they used the iron weapons that were created by the Hittites, and they also were not very nice. And so they used the idea of fear and terror quite a bit. They destroyed the land where they fought and took over. They treated anybody that they conquered as slaves, and they were treated very poorly. For example, on page 62, it talks about King Ashurnasirpal. 3,000 of their combat troops I felled with weapons. Many I took alive. From some of these I cut off their hands to the wrist. For some of these I cut off their noses, ears, and fingers. I put out the eyes of many of the soldiers. I burned their young men and women to death. So they definitely didn't just take over a group of people, they destroyed groups of people. All right, so then we need to mention something before we get into the Persian Empire, but we need to mention the Chaldeans, who were the ones that took over the Persians. They were from Babylon, and the leader of the Chaldeans was Nebuchadnezzar II. And Babylon was the capital, as I mentioned, and they ruled this area for 73 years until the Persians took them over. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is known mostly for his Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which we will get into a little bit more. It's talking about, one of the ancient wonders, and this just gives you some ideas of pictures of what it looked like back in the day. All right, so the Chaldean Empire looks very similar to the Assyrian Empire, and it will look very similar to the Persian Empire, who then added land to it. The Persian Empire. The Persians were an Indo-European people, again, that had some of those same languages that we mentioned earlier, and they lived in Persia, which is in present-day Iran. And if you look at page 63, it has a map there of the Persian Empire. And this was a large empire, and it was controlled, or at least started, by Cyrus the Great. And he ruled from 559 to 530. And unlike the other Assyrian kings, he did actually treat the captors well. So much so that the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. If you remember back from section 3, the Jews were taken over by the Assyrians, who were taken over by the Chaldeans, who were then taken over by the Persians, and most of those other people treated them quite poorly, but the Persians allowed them to return back to their homeland. All right, so we've already have all of these places located here. We just added Assyria not too long ago, so now we're going to add Persia, which is by the Persian Gulf, so that should be very easy to remember where Persia is located. All right, leaders after Cyrus the Great also made Persia a very large empire. Cambyses added Egypt, Darius added western parts of India and later parts of Europe. And when it gets extended to the biggest point, the Persian Empire was the largest empire to date in history at this point, at 500 BC. Since it was so large, they had to divide this empire into 20 provinces called satrapies. And each satrapy or province was ruled by a governor called a satrap, which also translates to protector of the kingdom. So Darius had these satrapies that had satraps that reported directly back to him. They were also in charge of collecting taxes, making sure laws were enforced, and recruiting soldiers for their very large army. Now, they too had a very efficient system of communication, just like the Assyrians did. They created the Royal Road, which was actually part of the road system that the Assyrians created, but they added to it. And this Royal Road went from Lydia, which was the capital of the Lydians' empire, who created coins, to Susa, the capital of Persia. And they, of course, used it to be able to communicate and travel and get soldiers to the outer sides of the empire. Now, the Lydians, who lived in Lydia, were the first people to come up with coins. Up to this point, nobody was using a system of money. So the Lydians get credit for having the first system of money. Instead of using bartering, they would now use coins. Bills or paper money were created much later. The Persians had the Army of the Immortals, and this was soldiers on horseback and foot soldiers that numbered at about 10,000 men, and they never let it go below 10,000. So if they would have a battle and they would lose 1,000 people, they would send 1,000 more people in to replace them. So they weren't really immortal in the sense that they never died, but since the number was never allowed to go below 10,000, it seemed like enemies could never make their army go away because it just kept filling and filling no matter how many men that they killed. Now, a large empire is very difficult to protect, and after Darius, most of the kings of the Persian Empire really weren't concerned about protecting it, wasn't concerned about making it larger. They just were soaking up all of the luxuries that they had, and a lot of loyalty seemed to dip at this point towards the king, so the soldiers weren't really loyal as well. There was a lot of struggles to who was going to rule next, a lot within families, and so it weakened the monarchy that the Persian Empire had, or the king or queenship, and really a lot of chaos within. And again, this is very common. We'll talk about this as a theme with the Roman Empire as well. When you get a large empire and you get some corruption in the government, they're plotting to kill each other, and the kids wanted power but didn't have much power, and the wives, where they were getting power hungry, it really caused a lot of issues. And so that allowed or opened the door for Alexander the Great from Macedonia to come in and take over the Persian Empire in around 330 BC. The last thing that we're going to talk about the Persian Empire is their religion. And Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion that was named after the person that created it, Zoroaster. And it was all about kind of good versus evil. And again, it was a monotheistic religion. So it had one God, and you're always fighting evil. And because this Persian Empire was so large, this religion kind of extended throughout all of those and really has existed even into parts of this world today. All right, so our map, we should have all of the locations except Lydia, so add Lydia. That is on the western side of Asia Minor, and remember that is the beginning of the Royal Road. And on the back of the map, we are going to finalize all of our information for our chart. You should have Babylonians and Sumerians from section 1, Egyptians from section 2, Hittites, Israelites, and Hebrews from section 3, Phoenicians as well, and then Assyrians were from Assyria, present-day Syria, that's easy, Assyria and Syria, and they came up with roads. They really constructed quite a bit of roads. They had that library of cuneiform tablets at Nineveh, and they created the first Pony Express for communication. The Chaldeans lived back in Mesopotamia, or Babylon, present-day Iraq, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, created by Nebuchadnezzar, is their contribution to the world. Lydians lived in the capital city of Lydia, which was the beginning of the Royal Road, which is present-day Turkey, and they were the first ones to come up with coins or coinage. The Persians lived in Persia, present-day Iran, and they built the Royal Road, which was later used by the Romans, and the religion of Zoroastrianism, which still exists today.